And welcome once again to the Tzemach Bible Institute program. I'm John Klein. With me tonight, as usual, is Ken Garrison, pastor of Fellowship Church and founder of the Tzemach Bible Institute. Good evening, Ken.
Good evening, John.
Ken, do you have some current events for us?
Yes, John, I just want to make a few comments concerning the present upheaval that we see in the Palestinian-controlled area in the land of Israel. Last week, Hamas forces in Gaza overran the Palestinian Fatah positions and took control of Gaza. Fatah forces were either killed or captured or they fled into Egypt. Now, Fatah still controls the heartland of Israel in Judea and Samaria, and so now the Palestinians are divided into two separate and opposing authorities. The Palestinian Authority under President Abbas in Judea and Samaria, and the Hamas forces in Gaza. Now these are obviously opposing forces. They're in a civil war, striking at one another. Fatah supposedly is secular oriented or secular based, while the Hamas is religious based and supported by Iran. Both of these groups, however, both openly utilize terrorism to pursue their goals. Indeed, the Palestinian Authority, which is just renamed for the PLO that we've known in previous generations, and the PLO is indeed the father of modern Islamic terrorism. So both of these groups are terrorist groups.
Now, if you're getting killed, you don't care if they're religious or secular, is that right?
It makes very little difference.
Right.
I mean, we see in the political cartoons today a general recognition of that reality. In the Sentinel today, in fact, Summers did an editorial cartoon very much showing that. Now, everybody recognizes that. I mean, it's if you see political cartoons showing that, then you recognize that this is general knowledge. Now, what's impossible for me to fathom, to understand, is that the Bush administration is currently rushing to try to bolster up Fatah in Judea and Samaria by giving them weapons and literally millions of dollars. This totally ignores the goals and the techniques of Fatah, and that is simply Islamic terrorism, just like with Hamas. Now, at the same time that we have literally thousands of young men and women who have died, in fact, in either Iraq or Afghanistan fighting terrorism, we, on the other hand, are openly and boldly supporting terrorism in Israel. Most of the money and the weapons will most likely fall into the hands of Hamas in the very near future, because we believe that Hamas will prevail also in Judea and Samaria. Now, we as believers, we as concerned citizens must indeed force the administration, and they're not going to do it of their own accord. We must force the administration to admit and declare that the so-called Middle East peace process is dead. The two-state solution is dead. There will not be a Palestinian state. We must at the same time encourage Israel to take authority throughout their territories and move boldly to utterly eradicate both Hamas and Fatah. That's the reality of the war on terrorism. And we have a responsibility, and I want to encourage us today to take that type of position with your senators and representatives and with the administration. I'll just simply state there has never been a Middle East peace plan. There is not one now, and there never will be, short of God establishing His kingdom in Jerusalem.
Well, thank you, Ken. Now, that brings us to tonight's question. Is it God's will that there be peace in the Middle East, Ken?
John, that question almost seems counterintuitive. But the answer to that, if we can understand Bible prophecy and what's happening in the world today, we would have to answer that question by saying, no, it's not God's will that there be peace. And that is to say that it's not God's will that somehow we just smooth over these bold oppositions, but God is working to root out the cause of the opposition in the
so
first
God's
place.
got a peace plan, and no other peace plan will work, period. So it's an exercise in futility, and more people are going to die, more Palestinians are going to suffer, and more Jewish people are going to die, and consequently more American soldiers are going to die because of our immoral policies or our inconsistencies in the world.
And not recognizing the simple fact of what happened. And obviously, we are not opposed to the war on terrorism. This country was attacked on 9/11, and we did, and we must respond to that. And I feel strongly that we're going to see many more attacks and be forced to respond. But when it comes to the nation of Israel, and when we consider what's happening in the nation of Israel, we have to look a little bit deeper and see if we can understand what God is doing.
And we can't have a contradictory policy like you stated.
Absolutely.
War on terror everywhere in the world, but we allow terror in the Palestinian,
well,
the so-called Palestinian
I don't like your
territory.
word allow. We are boldly advocating and supporting it.
Supporting it.
Okay. I mean, allowing it is one thing, but actively and strongly supporting
and arming it. You're right.
We're arming it both with weapons and with money. It's absolutely incredible.
So the whole world is pressing for a Middle East peace. Is such a peace plan realistic in light of what God is doing today? We can only come up with what?
Right.
Then?
Well, it's not God's will that we just foster some sort of false peace. Okay. He's working at the real issue. Now, we want to consider the real conflict that we see in Israel, and we're going to look at things, obviously, from a biblical perspective. That's what we do. And so we want to ask the question, is there a valid Palestinian claim to the land? We hear all kinds of claims of the Palestinians for their ancient homeland and all of that. So let me just ask that question to you, John. Do you think that there is a valid Palestinian claim to...
Well, I guess you could... Now, it all depends what you consider valid. There was an Arab presence in the land for these last 1,000 or so years, but it was very small. The large influx of Arab people to the land of Israel started in the late 1800s with the advent of the Jews coming from Europe. As they came back, Arabs came because the Jews paid a better wage than the Arabs could get in their native lands. So most of the Arabs that, just like the Jews actually, that came from Europe, now they have a history in the land, the Jewish people, 2,000-year history, but the Arabs came back about the same time they started coming back. They haven't been here forever, Ken.
Right. There, as you say, there's been a scattering number of people. Now you don't have to take our word that this is the truth. You can read Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad. He traveled in the land in the 1870s, and he'd travel all day and not see a single person. So we know that the land was almost completely depopulated. And then following that, Joan Peters wrote a book. It was published in the 80s, I believe, from Time Immemorial, where she systematically documents just what you were talking about.
Joan Peters is a scholar, not Jewish. She's English, and she just wanted to get to the bottom of the thing. Prior to Mark Twain, there was Wilson and Robinson. They were archaeologists, British and American archaeologists in the 1830s, 40s, 50s that did archaeology around the Temple Mount. And they also concur exactly with Mark Twain.
All right, so this is not just mere speculation. There's clear-cut historical documentation of the fact that we're citing here today. Now, the real reason that the Palestinians are claiming the land is religious and Islamic, because Israel was one of the first territories outside the Arabian Peninsula that was taken in the Islamic conquest in the 7th century. And as a result of that, falls in the heart of what is referred to as Dar al-Islam, and the land of Islam, the land already conquered by Islam. And so with a independent Israeli state there, it is a counter to that very concept of the superiority of Islam and the Dar al-Islam.
Okay, the plain truth then, the truth that the world doesn't want to really face is that no peace plan is possible, because it's from a religious point of view. Most Muslims, serious Muslims, cannot allow a Jewish presence in what is the heart of Dar al-Islam. So there cannot be a sovereign Jewish nation.
No.
Period.
So
how could you have a peace plan?
Every serious Muslim must work for the destruction, eradication of
either
the
that, or they have to
authority.
throw away their Quran as not a reliable document.
Right. Okay, let's reverse that pattern, and I'll ask the same question. Is there a Jewish claim to the land? And so how would you respond to that, John?
Okay, so there's been a small Jewish presence in the land, larger than the Muslim presence, by the way. The Jews were larger than Christians and Muslims in the land of Israel all these centuries, but still basically in 4 communities, Jerusalem, Hebron, Tiberias, Safed, whatever, but that was it too. That claim is about the same with the Jews and the Muslims. We have to go back a little further to a biblical claim to see who lived in the land for 2,000-year presence and what happened since.
Okay, so then...
Or at least 1,500 years.
So when we go back to a biblical perspective, we see something altogether different. We see an absolute Jewish claim to the land. It is this very place that God brought Abraham to, 4,000 years ago, and said to your descendants, I'm going to give this land forever. And so we have the whole Bible being centered in this very area. And even when God was judging his people Israel and sending them out into the midst of the nations, scattering them in the dispersion, he spoke to the prophet of record at that time, that is Jeremiah, and made a very bold statement about the promise of the ingathering and bringing them back in the land. So I'm going to ask John to read that statement from Jeremiah. And Jeremiah said this in many different ways, but in Jeremiah 16, he makes a very, very bold statement to this effect.
Now, every Christian, and this is a station that Bible-believing Christians tune into, knows about the Passover, the great story of the Passover, of God's miraculous deliverance of Israel, who were a group of slaves, from the lone superpower of the day. Now, in Jeremiah's day, the superpower of the day was Nebuchadnezzar, and he was carrying off the Jews into captivity. In the middle of that, God declares this in Jeremiah 16, starting in verse 14. Therefore, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when it will no longer be said, as the Lord lives, who brought up the sons of Israel out of the land of Egypt, but as the Lord lives, who brought up the sons of Israel from the land of the north, and for all the countries where he had banished them. For I will restore them to their own land, which I gave to their fathers. And in Jeremiah 31, verse 10, God says, hear the word of the Lord, O nations, and declare it in the coastlands far off, and say, he who scattered Israel will regather him, and keep him as a shepherd keeps his flock. So that's kind of bold.
All right.
God said
Absolutely.
what he's done in our generation is more miraculous than what he did in the Exodus from Egypt.
Absolutely, and from a biblical perspective, there is simply no ambiguity about God's intention and will in this matter. And as you indicate, we believe that we're seeing the actual fulfillment of these very prophecies that has occurred basically over the past 120 years. Now, a lot of people look at the ingathering of the Jewish people, especially after the Holocaust, as sort of a humanitarian gesture on the part of God. The Bible does not support that idea. God has his own plan and his own purpose. My wife wrote a song some years ago called the Master Plan. The Master Plan, speaking of the peace plan that God is implementing. And we're going to cite some of the prophecies that deal with God's master plan for peace. And we want to start by reading from the prophet Joel in chapter 3. John, we read that many times, but it bears repeating.
It bears repeating. Now, think about this, brothers and sisters. In every peace plan calls for trading land for peace. The United States peace plan calls for trading land for peace. The Quartet, the Roadmap, the Madrid Conference, the Oslo Accords.
You can go back as far as you want to, but it's all the same.
Man's peace plan calls for trading land for peace. This is what God has to say about trading land for peace. For behold, in those days and at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Then I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my inheritance Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations, and they have divided my land. Whose land is it, Ken?
It's God's land. Now, and this statement by Joel does not stand by itself. We have it repeated over and over again in the scriptures. We want to go to the prophet Zechariah, who spoke, maybe 70 years or so after the time of Jeremiah, and he says pretty much the same thing. Would you read from Zechariah 12, John?
All right. We're going to start in verse 2. Behold, I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling to all the peoples around. And when the siege is against Jerusalem, it will also be against Judah. Now, we are having a non-combative siege right now from all the nations because they all want Israel to give up Jerusalem, the heart of Jerusalem, and the whole world is anti-Israel, frankly. All right, and this is what God said, and it will come about in that day that I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples, and all who lift it will be severely injured, and all the nations of the earth will be gathered against it. So we're heading to a more of a siege than we have now.
Absolutely.
We're looking at an armed attack of Jerusalem.
This, by the way, I sometimes refer to as God's Armageddon plan. We hear a lot about Armageddon, Har Megiddo in Hebrew. But God has from the very beginning announced that this is the means by which he will ultimately judge the nations. And he has regathered Israel into the land today, and as they are, they become a lure to the nations for the nations to attempt to solve the Jewish problem, so to speak. And now Israel is uniquely vulnerable, or appears to be uniquely vulnerable, because God has brought them. I read somewhere when somebody called it now we've got the prospect of a one-bomb solution because so many of the Jewish people are gathered into one place. But we cannot, and our exhortation obviously, we cannot ignore from a biblical perspective that God is in the midst of this thing and he's doing something. God has gathered, restored, and then he is entering into judgment with the nations. That's what John read both in Joel and in Zechariah, and the prophet Ezekiel says much of the same thing. So the rebellion in mankind is fomenting and coming to a head, and Israel is sitting there as a lure, and God is going to enter into judgment with the nations.
All right.
So that's his peace plan.
So God intends to do something in the midst of a regathered Israel. Now this is important. God intends to do something in the midst of a regathered Israel that will prod the nations to overtly act and act out their rebellion by rejecting God and rejecting God's anointed nation or God's peace plan.
What do you think most likely thing is?
Most likely, it's going to be today is the Palestinian issue. So even in the midst of this, God is using the Palestinian issue to cause the nations to rise up and overtly attack Israel. Now, why would he want to do something like that, Ken?
Well, again, God is drawing out the rebellion in mankind. Rather than just kind of smooth over the rebellion and establish some sort of supposedly short-term semi-peace, God is working at the root cause of the rebellion in man that dates all the way back to the Garden of Eden. And now we've come to the fullness of the ages and the climax of the ages, and the deliverance is about to occur, and we're seeing the this thing happening and developing. Now I'll make a statement that I believe that Israel's position is going to become bolder and bolder. Their position is going to become stronger and stronger, and the Palestinian position is going to become weaker and weaker. I believe that we're seeing that process take place right now. So the plight of the Palestinians, I believe, is going to grow increasingly worse. And we know how the media and governments in general are going to respond to that.
All right. Now, the truth of the matter is God is operating, and if you're going against what the scriptures say, then you're going against God. Now, why was Ken able to make a statement like Israel's condition Israel's going to get better and better and more powerful, more light is going to be shined upon it? You remember last week, Gary Cooperberg, who lives in Kiryat Arba, was on the program, and he declared that Israel's about the size of Rhode Island, 5 million Jews. We have all the Moslem land, about 600 or 700 times the size of Israel, 300 million people, and all the problems of the world are going to be solved if Israel gives up another little tiny piece of territory. Listen, the world is trying to force Israel to do that, and here's what Isaiah had to say about it 2,700 years ago. This was God's opinion then. Verse 17, Isaiah 54, no weapon that is formed against you will prosper, and every tongue that accuses you in judgment you will condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their vindication is from me, declares the Lord. So Israel's position is going to get better, as Ken said, and the Palestinian position is going to get worse. That's the way it is.
We believe that we're seeing a repetition of exactly the same thing that happened in the initial conquest of the land under Joshua following the time of Moses. In those days, the Bible says that God hardened the hearts of the Palestinians of that day, and so they would enter into battle and utterly be destroyed. Do you have that scripture, John, out of Joshua?
Okay, let's look at it in
Joshua 11:20. Just read that if you would, because it tells us what God did then, and he's doing it today.
Okay. For it was of the Lord to harden their hearts, to meet Israel in battle, in order that he might utterly destroy them, that they might receive no mercy, but that he might destroy them just as the Lord had commanded Moses.
Now, that happened then, and we believe that we started out commenting about the Hamas takeover of the Fatah. The Hamas is considered even more radical than the Fatah. And so the term hardening of their hearts, My translation of that from the Hebrew is that they have become foolishly aggressive. No compromise, fight to the death, and that's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to get killed. And the Palestinian position is going to deteriorate and get progressively worse. It's going to be portrayed on the evening news and in your newspapers. The poor Palestinians overrun, downtrodden, and eventually the nations will no longer be able to tolerate it.
This brutal Israel, this
brutal,
big giant.
That's
Could you
right.
imagine that Israel is now perceived amongst the nations as Goliath, and the Muslims around the surrounding nations are perceived as little David? Could you imagine that? Listen, the Palestinians are already using that. They cry, they're oppressed, they're the poor, oh help me, and the nations are building up to help them. They fall over themselves to win favor with the so-called Palestinian people. It's just a matter of time till the nations, as Ken said, overtly act against Israel.
So let's go back to the original question that John asked. Is peace in the Middle East God's will? Not at this time. We see God clearly gathering his people and precipitating action-reaction, precipitating the nations coming up, and we're going to see a great deliverance with the coming of Messiah and the establishment of the kingdom of God. Now, all of us then have to ask ourselves the question, how do we view these events and where do we stand? As believers, as local churches, and as a community as a whole, where do we stand in this conflict?
All right. Do you see the events from a biblical point of view, or do you see it from a humanitarian point of view? You're looking at it from God's side or from man's side? This is the question that would be before you. And remember, according to the scriptures, if you're on man's side, then you will continually become an enemy of God, because only God's peace plan will work. God's peace plan isn't for this season or the next season, it's forever, and that's the only peace plan that would work in.
One statement that I've made from time to time is that as we see this thing developing, your neighbor's children will be the soldiers marching up to Armageddon. And I believe that's a reality in our day. John, you're going to take some folks to visit these very sites.
Yep, we are taking a trip at the end of October, the beginning of November. We're going up to Israel. We're going to be in the settlements in Judea and Samaria. We'll stay a couple of weeks in the land. I invite you to come in, call in, write in for a brochure. Join us. See for yourself what God is doing in the world today. Well, that's our program for tonight. Shalom.